This is Uncovering Dark Falls, the only podcast in town that's officially banned from the town library bulletin board since our last episode. Kind of proud of that one. This is Gideon Brooks. I've done a lot of digging on this cornfield that's here in my town, and I'm just going to jump right into the good stuff, man. The locals called it the Endless Cornfields, but its actual name was the Kurt Family Farm. I could finally see the massive cornfield as I made my way down the empty road, and having the farm in full view now, I understood why it was widely known as the Endless Cornfields, because it really did seem like the fields went on for forever. Driving through the rural countryside brought back some memories of my childhood. Before I moved to Dark Falls, I used to visit my uncle's farm from time to time, so the scene made me a little bit nostalgic, let's say. With that said, my uncle's farm was much smaller than this, though, as the Kurt family farm was about 3 times its size. I finally stopped my car and I gazed out into the field. I started to imagine how it would feel to run through the stalks and just how easily I could get lost in there, surrounded by nothing except for miles and miles of this dry, yellow corn with nobody in sight to help me. Well, no one except for the large wooden men with these burlap faces and hair made out of hay. These wooded men are actually the reason I'm here. I needed to see them with my own eyes. Now, my research into the strange town of Dark Falls has taken me down, admittedly several outlandish rabbit holes if you've been following me so far. But this particular case might be one of the most bizarre and puzzling occurrences that I've ever investigated. It was a bit tricky to kind of piece it all together, as most of my findings came from word of mouth, in addition to a nearly 30-year-old newspaper article that mentioned something about a series of sudden fires burning through the cornfields at the Kurt family farm one summer night. However, after some extensive research and more than a few dead ends, I managed to piece together the entire story. I want to preface this by saying that, just like most of the cases that I've uncovered in Dark Falls, the events that you're about to hear are extremely out of the ordinary. And believe me, I had some doubts at first, and I questioned everything that I discovered as I dug deeper into the research. However, as I stood in front of the field, seeing the scorch marks in the distance with my own eyes, I realized that when it comes to the town of Dark Falls, there's always some truth behind the madness and the irregular nature of these cases. According to witness statements, the bizarre events all began with the arrival of Kurt's grandkids, a 12-year-old girl named Jody and a 10-year-old boy named Mark. They arrived on their grandfather's remote farm on the 13th of August, 1996. The Kurt family farm was located on the outskirts of Dark Falls, and it spanned 5 acres of land. There was a large, old farmhouse where the family stayed. There was a barn and multiple outbuildings, which were, kind of common for rural working farms. Records show that the arrival of Kurt's grandchildren to the remote farm wasn't entirely uncommon. Both Jody and Mark had been visiting the farm every summer since they were little. However, according to close family friends and several other witnesses who spoke to the children extensively after the incident that summer, both Jody and Mark had repeatedly stated that something felt off during this particular visit. Jody had apparently described how things felt at the beginning of that summer, saying, "Coming out to see Grandpa Kurt was always the highlight of my summers. The farm was so peaceful, with Grandpa usually telling his jokes and Grandma cooking up something for us to eat in the kitchen. But during this particular visit, the once familiar and peaceful farm now felt cold. Grandpa wasn't telling his usual jokes anymore, and the sweet smell of Grandma's cooking was nowhere to be found. The lively farmhouse that I'd grown to know and love was now eerily quiet, and even though the people who lived there still looked like my grandparents, it felt like they'd been replaced by strangers. There were 6 people living in the classic, but slightly worn down Kurt country home during the dark fall summer of '96. And if you're hearing the music right now, I still cannot tell you where that's coming from. It seems to happen anytime I talk about a specific place, or a very particular part of town that I'm investigating. It's just something that I'm still trying to figure out. It's not me, I promise. The 67-year-old Kurt was the owner of the farm and the man of the house. His 63-year-old wife, Miriam. Now, their farmhand was kind of an odd fella named Stanley. He was 45 years old, and they also had an awkward 16-year-old boy named Stick. That was Stanley's teenage son. The arrival of Jody and Mark brought the total to 6 residents in the farmhouse that summer. Both Jody and Mark later stated that they could tell something was wrong the moment they arrived, as their grandparents were acting a little nervous and mostly distracted, like they were really worried about something. In Jody's own words, quote, "Grandma Miriam was acting very odd. She had a constant worried look on her face, and Grandpa, who was always spouting joke after joke, was unusually quiet. I wondered if I'd walked into a different home." During prior summer visits, Grandma Miriam, who practically lived in the kitchen, had already cooked a feast for us that would usually be too much to eat in one sitting, while my grandpa excitedly told us all of the new jokes and stories that he'd picked up since we'd last visited. That warm atmosphere in the farmhouse that was once filled with laughter and stories was now gone. I didn't know why, but it had all been replaced with nothing but silence and just this faint feeling of dread. End quote. Their grandparents' behavior wasn't the only strange thing that the grandchildren noticed that summer. According to Jody and Mark's statements, there was now an alarming number of scarecrows littered across the cornfield. Witnesses also reported that in the months leading up to that summer, multiple new scarecrows had appeared in the Kurt family cornfield, leading to far more scarecrows than usual, or honestly even necessary if you ask me. According to the kids, there was something very uncanny about these new scarecrows. They looked disturbingly lifelike. In Mark's own words, quote, "I always used to laugh at the scarecrows when I'd visit Grandpa Kurt's farm in the past because there were always these kind of funny-looking, cheap, store-bought scarecrows that had the fake blush painted on their cheeks and everything, and these goofy-looking smiles. But I wasn't laughing when I saw these new ones. They looked more like angry wooded men than silly scarecrows." End quote. I decided to investigate deeper into the sudden rise in the number of scarecrows that summer, and I found out that all of them had been placed there by the 45-year-old farmhand, Stanley. Remember him? Records show that Stanley was indeed a very strange man. He wasn't just a little stitious, he was superstitious. That summer, the kids noticed him acting even stranger than usual, often muttering his own breath about keeping the scarecrows asleep. Now, several other witnesses who had been in contact with Stanley during this period said that he was constantly reading this book, and the book was called The Book of Superstition, and he would keep telling people about how he'd made a wish to make the scarecrows move by performing a ritual from that same book that had brought them to life. He was also incessantly telling anybody who would listen that the scarecrows on the Kurt farm only walked at midnight, and he insisted that the only way that they could be kept dormant was by following the rules and the rituals in his book. Now, I'm sure it would come as no surprise that nobody believed the seemingly insane Stanley. But in the days that followed Stanley's claims, both Jody and Mark, the grandkids, remember, they began to report strange events that led them to believe there might be some truth to Stanley's supposed insanity. It all started one fateful night when Jody was making her way back to the farmhouse. Everybody else was inside at the time, and while I couldn't find out exactly why Jody was outside that late, I'm assuming that she just left earlier that evening to get some fresh air and to take a break from sitting inside the eerily quiet farmhouse that now felt so foreign to her. As she inched closer to the porch, Jody swore that she saw sudden movement in the cornfield out of the corner of her eye. Confused, she called out to Stanley, thinking that he was out there doing something, right? But Stanley responded from inside the house. Jody recounted this moment in a detailed report, saying that a chill crept up her spine as she could have sworn that one of the newer scarecrows that she'd originally seen standing at the edge of the cornfield earlier that evening had moved. It was now stood disturbingly close to another scarecrow that had been positioned much deeper in the field. She later told a few of her friends that the first scarecrow had to have been at least 6 meters away from the second, or about 20 feet or so. But when she looked again, it had somehow pushed through the corn and was now just 2 meters away, 6 feet. The few reports that I could gather on the night also stated that Jody had told her younger brother Mark what she thought she saw, but, of course, he didn't believe her. He said she was probably just being paranoid, right? Go figure. However, at the end of that week, and in a bizarre manner similar to that of his sisters, Mark too would also experience his own strange encounter with the scarecrows. In Mark's own words, quote, "I thought Jody was pulling my leg when she told me about the wooden men moving. But when Saturday arrived and I was sitting with Grandma Miriam on the porch, I started to hear these unsettling whispers in the fields. They were distinct, hollow, and muffled, kind of like the voices of people without tongues. I initially thought that it was Stanley and his son, so I went to go check it out, but as I got closer, I started to hear these strange, sort of shuffling sounds followed by noises that I assumed just to be creaking wood. I wasn't able to find anybody there. And when I went back to the house, I saw Stanley looming behind my grandmother Miriam." End quote. As the days continued to pass, records showed that the children had now picked up some additional strange behavior from their grandparents. Now, while they were both still behaving out of character, Grandpa Kurt had also begun avoiding his cornfield entirely, which, according to older reports from friends of the Kurt family and locals alike, was a sharp contrast to how he'd behaved in the past. I mean, he would often playfully chase his grandkids through the cornfields whenever they visited, and sometimes he would spend hours on end working deep in the fields as it was his favorite pastime. His wife, Miriam, was also acting even more out of character, as it was noted that aside from no longer entering the kitchen to cook, which, as I covered earlier, was Miriam's favorite pastime, especially for the grandkids, she apparently couldn't look Stanley in the eyes and actively avoided being around him. It was hard for me to find any detailed records of Stanley and Miriam's relationship before that summer, but, it's believed that they were at least cordial. There was no reason not to be. This was yet another suspicious change, as both Miriam and Kurt now seemed visibly nervous around Stanley, as if he'd secretly done something to the couple that left them constantly unsettled. And you know what? I don't entirely blame them, man, because if you come to me with this giant book that you just found and it's full of rituals and spells and it's called the Book of Superstitions, and you just will not shut up about it, that's going to mess me up a little bit too. Jody was apparently so frightened that she started sleeping with a large stuffed teddy bear called Snuggles, which her grandparents had kept at the farmhouse. A former friend and an associate of Stick later revealed that the teenager was actually trying to prank the children during that summer, but unbeknownst to Stick, there was a real threat standing in those cornfields, and it wasn't long before it revealed itself on one fateful night. As I go deeper into this case, I remember a funny story that my uncle once told me about his farm. He said he was milking his cow, Betsy, late one night like he often did, but just as he finished and turned to leave the barn, Betsy, the cow, opened her mouth and wished him good night. Now, while my uncle swears by this story, my aunt just tells everyone that he probably had a little bit too much to drink earlier that evening, and it was just the liquor talking, not the cow. It's also a known fact that it's easy to see or hear things when you've been out in a remote location for some time with not another soul in sight. That said, while I didn't believe my uncle actually had a talking cow, I do believe the events that you're about to hear really did happen in the summer of '96 in my town of Dark Falls. Some say it was mass paranoia. Others say it was all just a hoax. But standing there and seeing the farmhouse with my own eyes, I believe it without any doubt that Jody, Mark, and Stick really did witness something unexplainable that summer night. The reports are all over the place, and it was complicated work to piece them all together, but I think it started when the clock struck midnight. According to reports from the kids and from Stick, who witnessed it all, the unnerving sounds of loud, creaking wood echoed in unison throughout the cornfields right at midnight, and the once stationary scarecrows began to move. Their movements were erratic as they inched closer, surrounding the farmhouse. It was never really specifically mentioned in any of the reports where Kurt and Miriam were while this was happening. I mean, you could speculate that they were asleep. They probably were. But some people say, some people heard stories from other family members, basically, that said they were actually paralyzed with fear and they were hiding inside their bedrooms watching the whole thing happen. We'll never know. Nonetheless, it was left to Jody, Mark, and Stick to fend these things off. As the wooded men continued to inch closer, the trio, still reeling from the shock that the scarecrows are alive, frantically searched for a way to destroy them before finally deciding on fire. Gasoline was brought in, and the moving wooded men with burlap faces and hair of hay were all scorched. They were all burned alive. Amidst all of the commotion, it was noted that Stanley's Book of Superstitions and Rituals, which was believed to have brought the scarecrows to life in the first place, was accidentally knocked into the fire, and that book burned too. The obsessed farmhand, who'd grown alarmingly attached to the book, attempted to save it, but was devastated when he failed. It was then stated that as the final pages of that book were charred up and the entire thing was just left to ash, the scarecrows slowly stopped in their tracks, and it wasn't long before they moved no more. The details of what happened after that night are still unclear, but it was later revealed that Stanley's ramblings were in fact true. He really did perform some, let's call it a ritual, that brought the scarecrows on the Kurt family farm to life. It was also stated that Stanley had used the fear of the animated scarecrows to control both Kurt and Miriam, telling them that if they didn't follow the rules in his little book of superstitions and spells and stuff, that the scarecrows would descend upon their home. Now, some of these bizarre rules included telling Kurt not to tell his usual jokes, as they actually disturbed the scarecrows. Those wooded men can't take a joke, man. It also instructed Miriam not to bake or cook certain dishes that she often did and loved to, as the smell of that cooking made the scarecrows uncomfortable. Stanley was the sole reason that the once warm farmhouse now felt cold and eerie. I wasn't able to find out what happened next, or where the Kurtz went after this, and I don't know where they live now. But I did uncover a final statement made by Jody to one of her best friends before leaving town, which was an unsettling confession where she had said, quote, "I thought it was over after that night, but as I lay in bed to sleep, hugging Snuggles, I could have sworn that the teddy bear moved its hands and hugged me back. I didn't sleep a wink. I just laid there, awake and terrified. Now, the next morning, early, I left Snuggles in my room because I was too scared to touch him. Then, Mark and I bid goodbye to the farmhouse that we once loved. End quote. I, Gideon, could still see the charred wooden corpses of the burnt scarecrows that had inched out of the field and surrounded the house from where I stood. I thought about getting a closer look, maybe even going inside to see what the farmhouse looked like after all these years, but I couldn't move my legs. I realized that I didn't have the courage to go in there and do it. And if Jody's last statements were true, the thought of fighting off a sentient, stuffed teddy bear called Snuggles made me hesitate to go snooping around the old farmhouse. Can you blame me? So, I took one last look at the Kurt family farm, or what was left of it at least. I got back into my car, and I made my way to uncover the new details of my next case in this strange and bizarre town of Dark Falls. You know, as I've been driving to the family farm, I've done it a couple times over the last, week or so, just to see if I could notice anything new when I look at it or work up the courage to go in. I've driven past this big K-12 school on the way there, and it's got this giant auditorium in the back of it. And every time I drive past the school, my phone just turns off completely. The Bluetooth in my car shuts off. Nothing really seems to work anymore. But surprisingly, everything turns back on and reconnects once it's out of sight, and I'm just a little bit further down the road. And driving past the school itself, just not only the fact does everything turn off when I drive past it, but I get this weird feeling that there's something going on inside there. And I think I'm going to go check it out. I'll see you guys next week with everything that I learned. Hey, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Uncovering Dark Falls. The music you're hearing now, I put it in. I found out where music is on the internet, and I found out how to download it and put it in a show. This is me. I did this one. All the other stuff, it just happens. Thank you for listening. Hey, consider joining the Patreon. It's $5 a month, and that gets you access to a bunch of stuff. Very early access to episodes. They're interruption-free episodes. And maybe most importantly is voting privileges. You know, I'm going to kind of lift the curtain a little bit here. We love Goosebumps. Me and the team behind Uncovering Dark Falls, it's a total of 3 people right now, love Goosebumps, dude. And we all have our favorite episodes and favorite stories and stuff from the series, but we want your help in figuring out which stories to cover next. If it wasn't obvious, you know, this episode was The Scarecrow Walks at Midnight. Just basically a very fun, interactive, engaging way to kind of retell that story. I hope that's how it comes across. But dude, there's 62 books, man. And we need help figuring out which order you want us to cover these in. So join the Patreon. You're going to see a big list of things to vote on, I suppose, and early access stuff. So check that out. And be a part of the show's, you know, growth and impact and everything else. Thanks again. Bye.
Uncovering Dark Falls is written by David Caleb and Dr. Plague. Created, produced, and narrated by Darek Weber.